V8 supercars are no strangers to a street circuit. Adelaide, Surfers Paradise and Townsville are just a few, and possibly in the future Canberra could be joining that list. Over recent weeks, Speed Cafe and other key media outlets have been reporting the possibility of a return to racing in Australia's capital city, as supercars look to expand the number of rounds on its schedule. But first, some history. As I'm sure many of you know, this wouldn't be supercars' first run around the streets of Canberra, as they held a short stint of events between 2000 and 2002, where after just 3 races, a changing government, dropping crowd numbers, and the fact it was freezing, or at least by Aussie standards, led to the races axing. But the track itself was an interesting one. It went past some of Canberra's key landmarks. It had mostly flowing corners and even some undulation to keep things interesting. In fact, despite the track's short lifespan, this place actually saw one of the most random moments in motorsport history.
No, he's going to miss Ellery.
Look at that.
How about
Beautiful
that?
timing.
Oh, that's going to go straight. No. Oh, over the tyres. Oh. You couldn't do it if you tried.
I was 5 when this happened, but now it is 2023 and it sounds like Canberra might be back on the cards. The location for the track is only rumoured at this stage, but it sounds like the new circuit will be around the Exhibition Park in Canberra, or EPIC as it's known for short. Now this area is no stranger to the car scene. It hosts the annual Summer Nats car show and burnout competition, and the wider area is currently seeing a lot of investment and revitalisation, and it sounds like supercars are trying to get some of that government funding for an event. So what does the track look like? Well, here it is. It's a 3.2 kilometre lap with 8 turns in an anti-clockwise direction, and the whole circuit would be located about 20 minutes drive from Parliament House in the heart of Canberra. In terms of a lap around this place, it's a fairly short run into the opening sequence of corners, which are a little bit awkward, it must be said. There's a left-hand bend followed by a slightly tighter right-hand kink to kick off the lap. After that, you go into a pretty fast right-hand sweeper that I think will just be about full throttle through there, and into turn 4, which is probably the first major overtaking opportunity, a 90-degree left-hander. That's followed by another 90-degree left-hander at the top there onto Morisset Road, I believe it's called. Then, you guessed it, a 90-degree left-hander onto Flemington Road, which takes the cars down a bendy back straight before finally, surprise, surprise, a couple more 90-degree left-handers that kind of remind me of the final corners at the old Sydney Olympic Park track, and that will bring you to the end of the lap. Now, I'm sure you can already sense what one of my complaints might be about this rumoured layout, but before we get into the overall pros and cons, let's take a look at each of the corners in a bit more detail, because from the moment I zoomed in on turns 1 and 2, I was intrigued because you can see just how narrow this road is in its current form. I think obviously hard to tell from Google Maps, I'm not familiar with the area myself, but it looks really narrow and difficult to get 2 cars side by side through here, even in its current form. So some widening would surely have to take place to make this feasible, but you can see we've got structures to the left and right of the proposed circuit, so some difficult discussions, or some serious discussions at the very least, would probably have to take place to free up a bit more land so there's more room for a track here. So after that, we have a right-hand sweeper that, looking at it again, probably won't be full throttle, to be honest with you, but I love the way this feeds into the following corner, the 90-degree left-hander. It's sort of at the top of frame there. That's pretty much a gravel road in its current form, at least on this image. So I really like this. I think the way you go through turn 3, especially if there's a bit of tyre wear involved as well, could really set up some strong overtaking at turn 4. So I really like this sequence, and I think it would be good for racing. After that though, it starts to feel a little bit familiar. We've got another 90-degree left-hander onto Morisset Road. Now, at the surface level, this one looks quite basic, but when you go down to Street View, there's actually quite a sharp incline up to Morisset Road where the supercars would be coming from. So hopefully if they did build a circuit here, that elevation difference would be retained, because I think it will help this corner stand out and feel a bit more unique to the rest. The next one onto Flemington Road is once again 90-degree left-hander by the looks of things, but the one thing I will say, at least each of these 90-degree lefts should appear visually a little bit different. The previous 2 sort of have that field backdrop. This one here, a bit more of a bit developed, built up area. So at least we should be able to recognize quite easily what part of the track they're on TV. After that, we do come down to those final two left-handers. There's quite a lot of street furniture and sort of traffic islands on Flemington Road that I'm sure would have to be removed for this race to happen. There's also a gate, I believe, sort of between these final two left-handers that would obviously also be knocked down to make this race happen. What I would say about this final couple of sequences, though, is that at least there's quite a clear path to enter pit lane. They can overshoot the final corner and hopefully go up this access road for a nice clean exit or entry into the pit lane, which isn't always the easiest thing to achieve on a street circuit. So when you do delve in, and I would encourage you to get onto Google Maps and take a look around the area itself as well. There's quite a lot of detail, some interesting quirks that could make this a bit more interesting to watch than it might first appear on paper. Okay, so with all that in mind, what do I think about this proposed location? Well, for a start, I think it's actually a really logical place to try and host a Supercars event. Yes, there's some question marks around the widths of the opening of the lap, but in terms of key facilities like the pit lane and paddock areas, there's a lot of space to work with here. You can obviously have that pit lane set up in the car park down the main straight. You've got grassed areas to the left where grandstands can go. You've got this massive track out the back where you can store support categories and the trucks of all the Supercars teams. And then of course, sort of in the top right of the track, you can see there's loads of open fields for plenty of parking, and then also train access as well. And the whole thing is only 20 minutes away from the heart of Canberra. So in terms of location, it actually seems to strike a really good balance between being, you know, in an urban area, but not right in the heart of it where it causes crazy disruption. And definitely compared to somewhere like Newcastle, it seems like a much more approachable venue and a far more logical one in terms of staging an event that doesn't have too many logistical headaches. The other key positive more on the racing side of things is that obviously this track would need a pretty substantial amount of widening and resurfacing, definitely in the first half of the lap. And I think that presents an opportunity to kind of tweak the exact geometry of the corners as well, and hopefully set it up for some really good racing. So what we see here from the satellite images isn't necessarily what we're going to get at the end of the day, but because there is a bit more space to work with, hopefully there is room for refinement and they can turn this slightly awkward start to the lap into something exciting and very raceable. And that leads me to my final positive, which is even if they leave the layout as it is like we see it right now, obviously with a bit of widening happening, I still see some clear overtaking opportunities. Turn 4 jumps out to me as the key one with that right hand sweeper before it. You've got another chance at turn 5, turn 6, and then some dive bombs likely happening at the end of the lap with that run into turns 7 and 8. I don't think they'll encourage the most exciting back and forth racing, but at least drivers should be able to overtake, and it shouldn't, touch wood, be a procession. What about the negatives, or at least the things that will need to be considered if this is pursued? Well, firstly, Supercars aren't getting away scot-free with the usual headaches of a street circuit. Yes, they're not dealing with huge disruption in a city centre, but the track is quite close to a suburb. I imagine the businesses on that Flemington Road junction will also be impacted, so there's still some consultation to be had there. I'm also really curious to see what happens with that opening sequence of corners with those structures to the left and right, because I just cannot see this project going ahead without something changing in that area to open up a bit of room for this track. So that could be a key headache and a pivotal part of whether this track happens or not. The other negative I've got, and you've probably sensed it throughout the whole video, I feel like there's one too many 90-degree corners, and they all go to the left as well, which doesn't really help the situation. The only positive I've got is that because they do have a bit of room to work with, especially in that sort of turn 4, 5 and 6 area, they might be able to play with the alignment to make one of these corners a bit more of a sweeper, sort of like your turn 6 at Melbourne, for example. So fingers crossed they can just break up those 90-degree left-handers. I don't inherently hate these really angular corners. I actually think they work quite well when they're packed close together, like we see with the staircase section in Adelaide. The problem with this layout is that these repetitive corners are all spread out, so they're not going to encourage those alternate lines that we enjoy at other places like Adelaide and even Newcastle in their staircase section to a certain extent. Then my final gripe with this Rumour track layout is just the location. It's not much of a looker, is it? With street circuits, One of the key advantages is that yes, you have to do a lot of stakeholder engagement and it's quite difficult to get them off the ground, but once you're there, you've got iconic backdrops with distinct landmarks in shot, you know, like the Adelaide Parklands with the CBD right behind it, or the beaches of Surfers Paradise in shot. The area around the Epic precinct is kind of a bit barren. It's not the most eye-catching, especially for TV audiences, but as I mentioned, maybe that extra space and that more open plan area is going to create a better racing situation, and maybe it will create a better experience for the fans on the ground as well. So what do you guys think? Well, I asked you that very question just a few days ago, and we had about 20% of people at either end of the spectrum. Some people are keen as on this idea and they like the track, others just don't think Supercars should bother with a race in the ACT whatsoever. But the majority of people, 61%, are keen on Supercars racing in the capital, but probably not on this layout, or at least want to see this layout adjusted. In terms of comments, we had one from Shiny Starmine Studios here saying, why didn't the original layout move the start line back or just adjust the first corner so we don't have cars literally stationary waiting for them to file through, and try to run it at a different time of year and maybe you can get something of it. The original layout, I had a look at Google Maps, all the roads necessary are still there, but they're right next to really historic buildings, really historic parks. I just don't see widening happening, unfortunately, in the modern day and age, and you could argue the track was too narrow for Supercars back in the early 2000s, so they most definitely wouldn't really be able to race around there. It's a bit of a shame though, because the original layout was a pretty flowy, interesting track in a fascinating location. What I would agree with though is the importance of seasonality. The cold weather is arguably what killed the original race in the early 2000s, so Supercars make the effort to get back to Canberra, especially with the investment required for a street circuit. They've got to make sure they host it at the right time of year in the warmer weather where fans will be attracted trackside. Isaac here brings up something I saw a lot of on my video where I explored the rumours of Supercars going to Singapore to support F1, and he brings up the fact a lot of people did, which is why are we looking at new locations and new street circuits when we've got tracks like Winton, Queensland Raceway, and Phillip Island just sitting there ready to go, you know, good facilities that have seen upgrades in recent years, and I could not agree with this anymore. If we're trying to build up this calendar and get more racing happening, it just seems crazy to take the risk on street circuits that have long lead times and no guarantee of success either. These tracks, they're good facilities, they've got dedicated fan bases nearby, so hopefully Supercars won't neglect these tracks too much longer. Then finally, Dan521 chips in saying, to be honest, I'm indifferent, as long as it doesn't replace something else on the schedule. And I think this was the theme I noticed most in all the responses. Supercars fans just want more racing, and if a street race around Canberra is a step towards that, I think the majority of fans will give it a shot. And the proposal here is decent. The track may not be the flashiest, but it's functional, and hopefully that means it will serve and stay on the calendar for a good period of time. If they can host this Canberra race in the warmer months, get the locals on board, and entice fans in Sydney and Melbourne to make the trek, this could be a mainstay on the schedule. And at a time where Supercars is rumoured to be pursuing more glitzy offshore races, perhaps following more of the F1 schedule, I think it's really important to offset those pursuits with events like this one that serve the local fans and are hosted in places that have a clear link to Australian car culture. But they are my thoughts on the rumours of racing returning to Canberra. Be sure to let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. My Darwin preview will be dropping in just a few days time, but in the meantime, treat people like your trackside down there in the comments, and I will see you in the next one.